I still remember the first time he showed me how to cast my line. His hands kept me steady as the cold mountain water rushed around my boots. Looking back on it, fishing with my grandfather in the eastern slopes, in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, were the best moments I had growing up. Patience, strength, trust. I learned a lot from spending time in those streams. The streams in the East Slopes are home to countless plants and animals, like Alberta's native trout. These special fish, the West Slope cutthroat, bull, and Athabasca rainbow trout, hold the memories of our past and the potential for our future in their fins. The waters they swim in keep everything alive, including the people living in the eastern slopes or downstream who rely on these streams for drinking water. When I go back to those lush places my grandfather used to take me, I see changes. The eastern slopes are well loved, but also heavily used. More activity over time has changed these lands and streams. Alberta's native trout are now gone from most streams, and the water that used to run cool, clean, clear, and connected is now overstressed, muddied, and disconnected. One day, I hope to bring my grandkids to these same places, to feel connected to these waters and these fish that my grandfather and I grew up with. We can still keep Alberta wild and bring back our trout. By keeping rivers and streams cold, clean, clear, and connected, we will get to enjoy Alberta's wilderness at its best for generations to come. Native trout are part of Alberta. Let's keep them here.
Good evening, and thank you for tuning into the first session of the Native Trout Stakeholder Workshop. My name is Amy McLeod. I am the Provincial Riparian Specialist and Eastern Slopes Program Coordinator for Cows and Fish, and I will be your host for this evening. Tonight, I'm joining you from Okinstis, Calgary, Alberta, and I honor and acknowledge that I live, work, and play on Treaty 7 land, the ancestral lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, shared with the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda, and the Métis Nation of Alberta. There are many others joining from across Alberta, so I also acknowledge the traditional territories of Treaty 4, 6, 8, 10, and of the many First Nations and Métis and Inuit people whose footsteps have marked these lands since time immemorial. The long relationship between Indigenous people and this land includes a deep knowledge and respect for the living and non-living entities that create this amazing place we call home. If you are tuning in from outside Alberta, please take a moment to acknowledge the land and the history of the land you are on. A few technical things before we get started. We will have 4 presentations today, after which we will have the presenters available to take questions. If you do have a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You are also welcome to leave comments, and we encourage you to do so, so long as they are respectful, and you can use the chat function for that. To change your view, you can go to the top of the screen where it says view. Speaker view will allow only the speaker to be displayed, whereas gallery view allows you to see multiple presenters. Also, we will be giving away prizes for our participants throughout the night. 2 pairs of tickets to the Calgary Adventure Show this weekend. Banded Peak has given us free growler with a free refill and hat. And we have 3 pairs of passes to Bow Habitat Station, as well as 5 Native Trout Collaborative sticker packs. So all attendees will be added to the draw, and you get bonus entries if you ask questions this evening. And so I'll get Logan, my wonderful assistant behind the scenes, to launch our first poll. And I would like to know who is joining us tonight. So please take a moment and fill out the poll. Let us know what sector you represent. If you have a moment, feel free to also use the chat function to tell us where you are tuning in from today. Well, it looks like 46% of people are representing the angler community today. A lot of consultants and industry, 20%, 6% agricultural producers, and 13% non-government or conservation organizations. So Logan, if you can close that poll, please. As I mentioned, I am with Cows and Fish, otherwise known as the Alberta Riparian Habitat Management Society. And Cows and Fish is a not-for-profit charitable organization that empowers people who live, work, and play in Alberta to care for riparian areas. And those are the areas that connect land and water. And I do often get asked about what cows have to do with fish. And for me, the answer is understanding relationships. So in this case, the relationship between cattle and their impact on the landscape and how that impacts fish and in general water. But it isn't just the relationship between cows and fish. There are many different human activities that impact the landscape and as a result, our water. Fish aren't just a product of the water, they are a product of the entire watershed, which includes land and us. And no matter where you are on the landscape, you are part of a watershed. So all of our activities add up to impact the health of the watershed and in turn ourselves. Cows and Fish moves past the polarization and recognizes that as all things are connected by water, we need to work together to find solutions that benefit us all. So riparian areas, those green threads along the water's edge, so the land, water, and the people together. And healthy riparian areas are critical for providing the clean, cold, connected, and complex waterways that native trout require. Alberta's native trout and their habitats are part of what makes Alberta such a special place to live. These fish, once abundant in Alberta, are listed as threatened and now confined to the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, where these headwater streams are their last stronghold. Not only are native trout our neighbors, but they're also indicators of the water they live in and the land that surrounds that water. If we look to native trout species to gauge our impact on the land and on the water, what might they tell us? Have we been good stewards of this shared space? With cumulative land pressures such as industry, forestry, grazing, recreation, population growth, and angling, it can be overwhelming to know where to focus recovery efforts. And there's no smoking gun, so to speak, when it comes to aquatic diversity decline. But what we can say for certain is that there is a decline. So recognizing those challenges presented with native trout recovery and the need to work together, Cows and Fish became part of the Native Trout Collaborative in 2019, which was initiated by Alberta Environment and Parks at the time, guided by their species at risk and recovery plans, and funded through the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So organizations that were working on different aspects of native trout recovery all came together to coordinate, prioritize, and leverage resources between programs. And our work maintaining and enhancing riparian habitats is part of that effort, but there are other ways to help native fish, and you'll hear about them through the 2 native trout stakeholder workshop sessions. This workshop is part of our ongoing commitment to support recovery, and we are happy to announce this is the 12th annual workshop we have hosted. Thank you to all the people who have helped put this workshop together, and to you who have supported this work along the way. Together, our actions are making a difference. And then without further ado, I would like to announce our first presenter, Craig DeMaere. So Craig, if you could show your beautiful face and start sharing your screen so we can see your presentation. Craig is a range management specialist for Alberta Forestry, Parks and Tourism. He is a Cows and Fish board member, and he has spent most of his career working on the prairies and the montane foothills of the eastern slopes of Alberta. Take it away, Craig.
Okay, you hear me okay, Amy?
Yes, and there's no barking dog in the background, so that's a bonus.
I got a dog in the background, so it could always happen here. So anyways, I was when I was asked to talk about grazing and riparian management, I really thought I should stay in my lane, hence the really boring title and of what I'm talking about. But hopefully at the end of this, I can share some insight of how public land is, grazing on public land is managed, and also how that relates to riparian management overall. So first part I wanted to do was set the stage here, that just of Alberta's crown land grazing. We're talking about over 7,000 disposition holders and 8 million acres in the province. As you see my little green map, all the little green dots are areas where public land grazing dispositions occur. They occur under grazing leases, licenses, and permits all through rangeland areas of the province. Just some markers on the way. Great, this isn't a new thing. The earliest grazing leases, long-term grazing leases, were as far back as 1881, and particularly in the Southwest. And those areas were, long-term leases that were continued on. Another marker was 1913, was the Forest Reserve, this area in here. You guys see my mouse, just so when I'm pointing at things, I know that that's occurring?
Yep.
Yep,
okay,
you can see it.
Okay, awesome. And so anyways, that area of the Forest Reserve, grazing occurred in that in 1913 as part of the establishment of the Forest Reserve. Another marker was 1931 when the Provincial Lands Act was enabled. There was provisions in there to allow leases on areas that weren't suitable to be broken up and that end of things. So one thing you got about these areas that are under Crown land is these are all multiple use landscapes. There's a whole wide range of values when we're talking about these areas, and much multiple use activities. One thing you always see that's typical about most rangelands is they have that riparian portions embedded in them. As you see on my little map on the left there, that there's a lot of riparian throughout the area. These are typically non-intensively managed. It's another characteristic, but we call it more extensive grazing. And that basically is that it's lower stocking rates and bigger areas, quite typically as compared to other practices. So the expectation, we got like 7,000 disposition holders that we're working with. The expectation is stewardship for these areas. So Alberta's Crown Land grazing program is delivered through the stewardship of the grazing disposition holders. That stewardship model is embedded in our documents, the operation standards document here, as well as the many of our support guiding documents such as stewardship end. All these documents, what they contain, all tie to utilizing the principles of range management in order to achieve these stewardship goals. The definition that we define stewardship as, just for that, is that responsible management of range and riparian resources, and the value of stewardship ends up being that sustainability. And so, yeah, the principles are what we use. Now, the other thing about the principles is they're embedded in many of the documents that we utilize, including cows and fish documents, multi-SAR documents. These principles are really important. I'm sure everybody's heard of them before, but I'm going to bounce through them just so everybody knows what I'm talking about. For those, I guess, with the demographic that we just went through, I should make sure that these are very clear. So one of the first principles of range management that we use is you have to balance the supply with the demand to maintain healthy rangeland. So you have a forage supply out there and you have a forage demand. One of the things about public land, though, is the forage demand isn't just livestock. In fact, that model that I have in the middle there shows that we do allocate some to livestock, but then you have to allocate some of the resource to wildlife, insects, overall biodiversity. And lastly, that plant maintenance itself, the plant itself has to be maintained, which and in turn the soils underneath. And so all those things have to be accounted for when you're talking about forage demand. A second principle that we go by is this: we need to provide effective rest after grazing. So typically a plant like rough fescue, the one pictured here, it's adapted, it's evolved with grazing, and so it can go, but it needs rest in order to be able to recharge, be able to photosynthesize, bring more power back to its roots. And as you can see through this model, that excessive grazing or overgrazing will really reduce the roots and reduce that plant. So we want to keep those plants healthy. A third principle is to avoid grazing during vulnerable periods. Now, this is basically the convention of this is always think about plants. Like in an annual cycle with plants, there's always a vulnerable period during that time. In native uplands, quite typically that's green up, when the grasses are turning green. You want them, as they're putting energy out, to provide sorry, dogs got me here. Provide power back to the roots. In riparian areas, when it's high moisture and there's much pugging and hummocking, or there's other times when there's a shrub preference, those areas can cause issues of plants when they're grazed during their vulnerable times. There's also vulnerability times for fish and wildlife. Multi-SAR would talk about that during nesting times is an important time where nesting birds can be vulnerable, as we see here, and also I looked everywhere for a picture of fish. I guess I'm a range guy. I don't have pictures of fish, but you'd think I'd have one, but couldn't find one. But there's certainly key times during a fish's cycle where time is vulnerable. The fourth principle and the last principle is distribute livestock evenly. And now this is something that we've dealt with quite a bit in our work. And that little picture at the right, all those brown dots are GPS collar dots, where we put GPS collars on livestock and trying to understand how they distribute themselves over landscape. You can see that they don't, in that big block there, they don't distribute themselves evenly, that there's areas like the features that we know and understand start to influence livestock are slope, accessibility to water, forage preference, canopy openness, seasonality of plants really influence livestock distribution. So knowledge of all this stuff really can help you understand how to distribute animals, especially in a riparian area where they're typically lower slope. Accessibility to water is obviously there, and there's usually a forage preference. So it's trying to understand that on the landscape. So those are the four principles that I wanted to go through here quickly. And then I just wanted to switch to applying these principles and this behavior that I was talking about and how it manages riparian areas. Well, one of the very first parts to this is that grazing planning, which is basically taking those principles and putting them into practice. And one of the fundamental parts to this is to know your landscape. This is where when you know your landscape, you can recognize, avoid, mitigate during key times. And as I said, this is both plants and animals. And the other is you can manage your land. Like an example is creating riparian pastures. This is a Benjamin Creek project up north that we worked on. But if you look at the 2008, this was an area where they developed a riparian fence. And again, all the dots are GPS collars. And you can see at that on the 2008, without any fence and no management, that they spent a lot of time along that creek and along that creek and you know, the south end of that lease. Once they put the fence in, and the fence would have been right here, that you could see that in the early graze that they grazed that area, and but in the later graze, when they excluded that the livestock actually utilized the area a heck of a lot further up the lease and distributed themselves much better. That's just the knowledge of that riparian pasture. Other ones is especially on managing for distribution is the distribution tools that you have available. Distribution tools such as riding is a really important one. Distributing your livestock, moving them around to other water sources, always keeping managing with your livestock. Temporary fences is a really important one. I have a few pictures of examples of cows and fish fencing and use of alternate waters that are really good examples of showing how you can utilize those tools in order to mitigate the issues. The other portion of this is spring developments. Quite often on a riparian issue that might be near the that's along the stream side, obviously, the answer might be a spring development up high that actually moves the cattle away and distributes them into other areas. So always working with these things that you know can attract cattle and move them or become very important components and ways of managing in these rangeland environments. One of the other important parts of this is recognizing access points. This was a project I did a long time ago, and basically you can see this was a GPS collar project where we connected the dots and then we ran intersections of where those dots intersected along the creek. And even though there was access all along the creek, you could see that there was 4 kind of common places where access was going. So that really showed us where to put troughs that were here, as well as other things. There was a narrow crossing or bridge in this area that basically it was to mitigate the use along of where they were accessing the most there and utilizing alternative spaces. Not everybody obviously has the GPS collars at their disposal, but a good plan with this stuff is understanding, using the assessments like what cows and fish have to understand where these areas are, where riparian areas might be lower than other areas, understand and find those plots and utilize your mitigation into those locations, mitigation such as this alternate water that is here. So don't know how well I did there, Amy, but I'm on my last slide there. And I just wanted to go through some conclusions here where hopefully I showed that riparian management is definitely linked to range management, that range management is like when the riparian area is embedded into all this public land, that you require knowledge and all these ways of dealing with your riparian areas. One thing I'd sure like to say is that stewardship definitely works best when groups recognize each other's interests on the landscape and work together. Like in a multiple use landscape, it becomes really essential, but it also can be the collaboration can actually have a lot of emergent properties. That's where where knowledge, communication, collaboration. Now, grazing managers have a very strong knowledge of how livestock utilize their landscapes. There's grazing managers out there who have been multi-generation, who really know their landscape. But there's other groups that have specific knowledge of other ecosystem parameters, like for instance, fish and wildlife habitat. And once you collaborate with all the different information, you can really come up with good solutions in that multiple use kind of environment. And the other big part of this is many groups can come and there can be multiple funding sources. And so no one group is feeling that they're taking the onus on themselves, especially when all others are going. Rattled on pretty quick there, but that is it there, Amy. So what's my next bit here? Shut her down?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Craig. That was excellent. Next up, we have a video that is debuting from the Native Trout Collaborative. It's the short film called Stories from the River, featuring a local rancher named Eric Butters. And I just need to cue up the video.
Well, water is absolutely critical to a ranching operation. If you don't have water, you don't have anything, and it's important to protect it and protect the riparian areas. And you know, we have crib springs and places that we draw on water for houses or livestock. But having that creek run down through the middle of the ranch is incredibly valuable. Well, my name's Eric Butters. My family and I operate a cattle ranch here near the Ghost River. Well, the creek's spring fed on the ranch. It runs a couple miles down into the Ghost River. It's called Robinson Creek. It's a source of water for livestock. We tend to try and keep the livestock away from the creek and pump water to troughs or haul water to troughs. So it's a very valuable part of the ranch, but it's also, I think, a very beautiful part of it. And you get a lot of satisfaction out of having a picnic on the creek or just walking along or riding along or whatever. So it's a huge lifestyle benefit for us to have that creek there. I haven't noticed so many this last couple of years, but there's always been fish in the creek. Cutthroat trout, brook trout a little bit, and there's been a few bull trout around. But the last period of dry years, as you saw, it's not a big stream. You know, there's been ups and downs in the population from what I can notice by riding by. You know, it's very unscientific. Well, we're standing here on the edge of what was once a cultivated field, which has now been planted back to grass, and the riparian area on the other side. And so we graze the native or the tame grass here at various times of the year, depending when we need it and when it's appropriate to graze it. And we don't graze the riparian area. And as you can see, there's a difference in foliage. You know, the area down around the creek is native sedges and grasses and willows and trees here and there. And they're vital to keeping the stream bank strong so that when a flood comes along, they don't wash it out. So that's sort of what I think is significant about this area is keeping the stock away from the riparian area. And with electric fences, relatively easy to do. Well, we hot wire off the creek year-round now, and it keeps the cows from grazing in the summertime if they're anywhere near in the summer, and it keeps them from browsing off in the wintertime. By keeping them out of there, you know, we're trying to do our part to protect the integrity of the stream and the quality of the water. In fact, here about 3 weeks ago, we had 2.5 inches of rain in about an hour and a half one evening, and the creek barely came up because all the area around the creek was so dry it just soaked it up like a sponge, which is of course what's supposed to happen, you know. And so you know, the riparian areas and some of the muskeg and other forested land around and whatnot just soaks up that water and probably recharged the aquifers a little bit, but try and let a stream do what its job is. I mean, I recognize it's a struggle for people because there's not a whole whack of money to be made in the cow-calf business. So two things: you don't have a lot of money to spend on extravagant things, but you know, if you sort of think your way through it a little bit, you can do a lot of things without spending a lot of money. And there's things that you can do that help out and chip away at stuff. And you know, places where streams are degraded, they didn't degrade overnight. It's a long, slow process. If you get old photographs from 100 years ago on a lot of the ranches, and things look different now, and suddenly the change is so incremental, people don't notice it happening until maybe they look at the old photos and stuff like that. And you need to understand you're not going to repair anything overnight either. It incrementally was damaged, perhaps, in some cases, and you can incrementally repair it without a great deal of cost. If you don't have you don't have water, you don't have anything. It's just satisfying to keep it as pristine as we can, to try and keep it in a natural landscape, because really cattle ranching is all about making use on a long-term basis, a sustainable basis, of playing the hand you're dealt. So it's nice to play that hand in a manner such that it is sustainable in the long run.
So thank you for tuning into that video. We'd like to pose another poll question. So I'll ask my friendly helper, Logan, to go ahead and put the poll up. So after watching this ranching related video, what best describes how you feel? Okay, thank you, Logan. Can you close the poll and share the results so the audience can see them, while I introduce our next two presenters for this evening? So we have Jessica Reilly with Alberta Fish, or formerly with Alberta Fish and Wildlife. Jessica is a passionate angler, growing up fly fishing near Edson and Rocky Mountain House. When not out on the river, she specializes in conservation genetics, cumulative effects modeling, and Arctic grayling. She currently works as the provincial recovery specialist for at-risk fish, focusing on a wide range of listed species from native trout to short-jaw cisco. And Laura MacPherson, again, Alberta Fish and Wildlife. Laura has been working as a biologist with Alberta Fish and Wildlife for 15 years. She's passionate about ensuring a legacy of fishing for future generations of Albertans. Whether it's camping or hiking with her family, or fly fishing and hunting with her girls-only crew of outdoor adventuring buddies, Laura is happiest when she's outside. So Jess and Laura, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
You bet.
Hand over the stage.
I'm going to share screens, and then I'm in Edmonton and Jess is in Cochrane. So we're going to try and, great. Okay. So so thanks so much for joining Jess and I for a discussion and presentation on what we think is Alberta's most difficult problem when attempting to recover native trout species, and that's cumulative effects. So as you've seen in others' presentations, the Alberta archives are full of these fascinating pictures showing how in the past, high harvest of native trout was the norm. We have photos of West Slope Cut from High River, and West Slope Cut are no longer there, or big bull trout from the Raven River, and they're extirpated today. We can also point to historical angler surveys that tell us how good the fishing used to be in many places in Alberta. However, as you've heard the saying, your grandparents' worst day of fishing is likely your best day of fishing. So one of the stories is the Tay River, and this is in central Eastern Slope. So decades ago, and he's here today. So hi Lauren, a now retired fisheries biologist, and likely many of the folks in this room know him as a friend. Lauren Fitch grew around the Tay River, and he remembers catching plentiful bull trout. Fast forward to 2018, and Peter Roger, who is also in the room tonight, and Jess were out electrofishing as part of a watershed fisheries inventory, and they electrofished 10 sites, no bull trout. That wasn't really surprising, because the general sense from people working and living in the area was that bull trout were already gone. But then lo and behold, at one site, they caught one. They were so shocked. After releasing it, they actually had to sit on the shoreline for a bit and think about what that meant for bull trout recovery. So in just one generation of biologists, from Lauren to Peter, we went from it being no problem to catch a bunch of big bull trout to being utterly shocked at catching one individual. In fact, in Jess and I's careers, We've only known our 3 native trout as listed species. I've never known them as large. I've never known them as abundant, nor have I ever eaten one of these fish, which a lot of people would argue having a shore lunch is part of enjoying a fishery. So why? Well, we all have our own pet peeve threat that we advocate for. So someone will go, it is habitat, it is absolute stream fragmentation. If we could just get rid of some of these problem culverts, then fish could get to spawning areas. Or it is absolutely OHVs, wrecking spawning habitat and stream habitat. Or it's hybrid, it's those darn non-native rainbows hybridizing with our native fish. Or it's harvest, there's too many anglers on the landscape and there's too much poaching. In reality, it's likely a combination of all these things in different proportions spread out over a large landscape. And so for many years, we've argued and we don't solve the problem. So the thing is, though, we all really care and we spend lots and lots of time and passionate effort writing recovery plans and management plans that say motherhood statements like increase collaborative efforts with DFO and continue to work with other government agencies. And in our experience, this just hasn't worked. So we kind of said, no more. We needed a new way to really think through this problem and to go from listing threats, which is an important first step, to on the ground meaningful recovery actions. So we did this in a modeling approach we call Joe modeling. And this isn't because it's easy and everyone could do it, which it kind of is though. We named it after Dr. Joseph Nelson, who was this lovely ichthyologist and world-renowned scientist from the University of Alberta. And used to go, well, if you wanted to know anything about fish, you ask Joe. And so that's why we named it Joe model in his honor. So what we do is we force ourselves to be really explicit on each one of these things that we say is bad. We draw a curve. So at what point is fine sediment really bad? And so this is really hard to see, but these are all the individual threats and how it would affect status. And then we combine them all to come up with something we call system capacity, but sort of just status of fish, in this case, Athabasca rainbow trout. The structure of this model could easily be applied to any other species or different system. Like if you wanted to figure out water quality in your lake and you figured out all of the different threats. So it's super applicable across a broad range of problems. And those in the room that love nerding out over scientific papers, I encourage you to read this lovely paper by Dr. Jordan Rosenfeld. And it's just talking about stress response curves and the use of ecological models. So for Athabasca rainbows, we actually integrated about 15 different stressor response curves, so 15 different threats as a model, in a single model. And the background, it looks horribly complex, like this big old spider web, but it's really not. So it's a simplified way of viewing threats in a single system, something arguably our Indigenous neighbors have been doing for a really long time. So the stressor response curves themselves are a combination of, hey, we go and we ask stakeholder input on like, what are the big scary things you think? We've held workshops, we collect field data, and then we also pour through scientific literature. So these curves are populated with the best available data and knowledge, and we're sure they're undoubtedly going to get refined through time as new information becomes available. So we use a Shiny Platforms, which is just a web-based platform. So this is bull trout range. Individual watersheds are then parameterized with each one of the threats and the threat values. And then for each watershed, we actually get a ranked list of threats. And so instead of just broadly saying fine sediment is a problem, each watershed sort of gets an individual threat recipe card. So you might get an output that looks something like this, where at the top here, where it's 1 or 100%, those aren't really a problem in this watershed. But for this watershed, it's like, well, angling might be a little bit of a problem in terms of poaching or catch and release mortality. We might have a little bit of a fragmentation issue with culverts, and sediment might be a problem. So one of the important things about this model is absolutely it's a hypothesis. This is based on the threats. This is what we think is going on with the fish population, but it's not predictive. you have to actually go out and do something about it. So this is a way to hypothesize what is going on in that landscape, go out and try and do something about it, and then refine your knowledge based on that. So where have we actually put this into practice? So it's not just a great idea. And for that, I will flip over to Jess.
Thanks, Laura. Let's see if I can make the slides go forward. Here we go, perfect. Yeah, so that was a great introduction. And now my job is to show you how we've used this model in real life, in a real recovery situation. And this kind of story happens out at Rocky Creek, Alberta. And for those of you who don't know where Rocky Creek is, it's a tributary to the Clearwater River, and it's just southwest of Rocky Mountain House. And there's a bull trout population there that we consider at very high risk. And we were curious, okay, well, what can we do to recover this population? What might be the key threats? So we use the Joe model as a great way to synthesize all of the information that we have about this watershed. And then, like Laura explained, we have a plot that kind of comes up like this, and we can check out and see, okay, well, it seems like there's maybe two major threats in this particular place. Maybe there's some issues around angling mortality and poaching, and sedimentation also seems to be an issue. And this also tells us that it's a cumulative issue between angling and sedimentation, potentially. So if we want to see recovery of bull trout in Rocky Creek, we really need to do something that addresses both of these pieces of the puzzle. So what is going on in this watershed? What can we do? Well, Rocky Creek had an extensive off-highway vehicle use network that kind of looked like this. And this is probably a very common image that you've seen when you were walking out around the east slopes. And because this OHV network was quite extensive, there was ample motorized vehicle access to most of the river fishermen. And also these highly compacted OHV trails were basically acting like sediment chutes. So anytime it rained, anytime there was a meltwater event, there would be tons of this sediment-laden water traveling down these OHV trails and being deposited in the creek. And really what we're most concerned about are the fine sediments that come down these OHV trails, and this is shown in the picture here. And eventually these fine or very small size particles will settle out from the water column and kind of jam up all of those little spaces between cobbles and gravel, and that can be a death sentence for bull trout eggs. And this is actually a picture of a West Slope cutthroat trout egg, but it kind of gives you an idea of what a bull trout egg would kind of look like. And you can see there's already some little pieces of fines getting stuck to the outside of the egg. So you can imagine, if it's just fully covered, again, that egg is not going to survive. So this is a serious issue for bull trout. So we needed to get to work addressing these crossings, and along the way, we also reduced motorized stream access. And so between us and our major partner, Trout Unlimited Canada, we've remediated 31 crossings over 20 kilometers. And we use simple bioengineering techniques, which I won't get into too much today, but generally bioengineering in this context anyway, it means we're using fairly natural materials, usually from the site, and only either very small machines or all manual labor. And to give you an idea of what that looks like, here we go. Here I am with some great Trout Unlimited volunteers. And I think even Elliot, you're in this picture too, just installing a straw wattle log. And the straw wattle will break down over time, but right now it's really acting as an erosion control device. And on top of that, of course, we plant grass and willows. And over time, this off-highway vehicle footprint will be revegetated, and it will address some of those sedimentation issues. In some cases, we want to be able to build up the stream back to its original height. And so you can imagine there was once an OHV trail right through this zone, but now we've pinned in 2 logs, we've backfilled it with soil and planted willows and grasses on top. And in a couple years, we go back to the site and this is what it looks like. So that's a great news story. But the key thing here that Laura mentioned is that using the Joe model, again, this is really a hypothesis, which means we need to test it. And to test it, we need to monitor fish populations and see, hey, did the action we took, did it mean something to this population? Did we see an improvement? And even though habitat remediation, it seems like a common sense thing, like, duh, you do good stuff for the habitat, you should see a response to fish population. It's actually more complicated than that. For example, we actually don't know how long it will take a fish population to respond to actions like this. And we also still don't have a really great idea about, well, how much habitat remediation is really enough. Like, it's probably more than planting a single willow, but it's probably less than completely re-engineering an entire stream. And we are curious about what that sweet spot is, and that really matters. So we don't waste money, we do too much remediation, but we also do enough that it matters to fish. So to meet this monitoring requirement, we surveyed the fish in Rocky Creek and in a couple of nearby watersheds as well for comparison purposes for 5 years. And we actually just wrapped up our monitoring program this summer. And I'm pleased to be able to report in tonight that we've seen a significant increase in bull trout in Rocky Creek. So that's a 5 times increase in immature bull trout and a 3 times increase in mature bull trout. So we are confident that we have moved the bull trout population there from a very high risk to a high risk status. And I'm curious if we continue our monitoring, if we'll see that status keep improving through time as this population again has more time to respond to the habitat remediation. What we did out in Rocky Creek, the habitat remediation work, that clearly worked well for Rocky Creek. But like Laura mentioned, that may not make sense in other places because depending on the watershed, there could be a completely different suite of threats. There's really no one size fits all solution. And in almost all cases, it's a complicated threat story. It's a cumulative issue. And a lot of these threats are confounded in space and time. So what makes a lot more sense to do is follow a similar process to what we use, which is basically generating a hypothesis used on the best available information and then testing it, rather than kind of going on our gut feel or being a little bit biased and kind of working on the threat that we think is most important. And so this is really the process that we're hoping to follow with native trout recovery across the east slopes. And I have to say, so I've been working on native trout recovery now in a really focused way for I think almost 10 years. And the momentum I've seen in native trout recovery in terms of building out these Joe models, working with partners, and really getting work done on the ground is impressive. And I know Laura started out the presentation saying, like, her and I have only ever known native trout to be at risk, but I am genuinely optimistic that our kids will know differently if we keep up this momentum that we've gained. And with that, I think that's all.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura and Jessica. Next up, we have Elliot Lindsay with Trout Unlimited Canada. So Elliot, you can go ahead and turn your camera on and share your screen. So Elliot is the project biologist with Trout Unlimited Canada and has been involved with Trout Unlimited since October 2012. He was first hired as a fish rescue technician. Born and raised in Calgary, Elliot loves fish and water and working with volunteers and stewardship groups to implement habitat rehabilitation projects throughout Western Canada. Outside of work, Elliot enjoys river snorkeling, and I'm completely amazed by the fact that Elliot can snorkel in some of these headwater streams of the eastern slopes because they are very cold. But his photography is brilliant, and we've used it for several different education tools. So thank you for that, Elliot. And as an aside, I once asked Elliot if he had a superpower, what would it be? And it was gills, so that he could breathe underwater. So with that, Elliot, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And can you hear me okay? Excellent. All right. So yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm really happy to be here. yeah, I feel like I'm among friends and colleagues when I'm looking through the attendees section. So this is great and very well attended. So thank you so much. Trout Unlimited Canada, we're a national organization. For those of you who don't know, we have an office in Calgary and another in Guelph, Ontario. And we're really fortunate to have quite a broad base of members, supporters, and partners all across Canada, including volunteer chapters that are located in most of the major centers. We have 5 chapters in Alberta. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this type of work, to please get in touch and consider joining a chapter. I'm sure they'd be really glad to have you. So today I'm going to be talking about beavers and fish. And so first of all, I'm just going to try and give a quick kind of history of beavers in North America. And really, I think we need to start with the fur trade, which was, you know, really the defining chapter for beavers and fish and people in North America. And this map, the kind of brown layer on the underneath is the current range of beaver. And all those little black dots are trading posts. And basically what I'm trying to show you with this picture is that there was beaver everywhere. So there was beaver in the prairies, there's beaver in the mountains, beaver in the foothills, there's beaver in the desert. There was beaver all over the place. And yeah, European settlers came and we turned them into hats. And we harvested a lot of these animals, and not just beavers. I think there's some badger hanging on the wall in that picture and looks like a bear. So we kind of commodified these animals and we took them off the landscape in vast quantities. And really this quote from Dr. Sherry Westbrook, who's kind of a beaver legend here in Alberta, just like underscoring that there is beaver in almost every headwater stream. So that is something that's really hard for us to conceptualize, and that's certainly not the picture we have today. And at the same time, there was a lot of fish. So fish and beaver were living together in high densities, much higher than we're used to seeing today. That top picture is me and some of my friends in their early 20s fishing on Trout Creek. And yeah, there's stringers of cutthroat trout. This is also Trout Creek in the bottom image. This is a tributary today. The fish are gone. And the beavers are gone for the most part as well. And some of these little quotes on the right-hand side of the screen are really cool to think about, just kind of like challenging our notion of what is normal today. So things like beavers are numerous in this upper part of the stream. This is talking about Trout Creek, a beautiful trout stream flowing through rich land and highly productive. Yeah, bull trout are gone from here, and west slope cutthroat trout are really close to gone or will be gone in the next few years if we don't do something pretty serious here. So it challenges us to ask, like, what is normal? Is that top picture normal? It's probably more normal than the bottom picture, but the bottom picture is what we see a lot more often. And this quote by Francis Backhouse is from a Reimagining Beaver article that came out in 2015. It's a really good read. And really it's talking about ecological amnesia and how for most of us settler people, we moved and lived here in an era when the beaver was already gone. So yeah, we have a skewed image. And you can tell that we have forgotten because we do things like this. We build neighborhoods like, I think this is Cranston along the bow. So we've diverted a little creek right into the middle of the neighborhood. And then now we're going to have some beaver problems because we've got, you know, some culverts and we got houses backing onto the little creek here. So, I mean, we kind of have just forgotten what a riverscape is and the processes that are happening there. So things have changed a lot. So following the fur trade, trapping kind of fell off. In some cases, it was basically scorched earth. So there was efforts to just get rid of the fur bearers to prevent competitors from moving in. And in some cases, we actually went backwards and we started putting beaver out on the landscape. So yes, beavers really were parachuted. And this little quote in the bottom of the cartoon, beaver dams in the mountains save water for fish, wildlife, and agriculture. That's like a key takeaway that, I mean, we're still kind of trying to expound this today. And really another interesting stat is that today we probably have like less than 3% of the historical population of beaver that were here prior to the fur trade. So we don't have like more beaver than ever, even though they are making a comeback. And this creek I stole from a presentation by my colleague Jack Imhoff, and it's an old cartoon, but I mean, we're still talking about these same messages today. So yeah, the bottom image, you can see it's just kind of like a simplified in size degraded stream. And some of the momentum continues with, on a positive note, you know, we've come a long way from trapping and killing all the beavers to parachuting beavers to coexistence with beavers. And there's some great resources out there from partner organizations like Mistaki Institute and Cows and Fish, like the Working with Beavers website. And yeah, there's even, I went on there today and there's even a cost calculator for pond levelers and coexistence tools. So there's some really cool resources out there available to anybody. So are beavers bad for fish? No, they're not. And yeah, so that'll conclude my talk. Thank you so much. No, I'm kidding. So obviously, really, it's the answer is no, because the question is not really, it's like, are fires bad for the forest? Well, I mean that's not a yes or no answer. Are floods bad for the river? It depends. First, we need to kind of ask, like, what is bad? What do we even mean by that? And there's a lot of questions. Only one of these questions that's making up this dam of questions is a yes/no question. That's, do beavers eat fish? No, they don't. But I mean, there's so much other questions that take a lot of time and explanation to unpack. And another question, which sounds like a really stupid question, is what is a fish? You might think of some things when you think of fish. I might think of some different animals when I think of fish, but historically, fish in a management context pretty much meant trout, and to a lesser extent, pike and walleye in this part of the world. And really, it's not just trout, it was usually one of these three. So brook trout, brown trout, and rainbow trout were kind of the big three. And so that kind of further complicates some of these questions. Ecologically speaking, a fish is a fish, right? So this is like kind of continuing down this silly question, but these are all fish, and these are all animals that are, I mean, some of these are probably thrilled that the stream is no longer flowing and now it's a beaver complex. The picture in the bottom right, that's some cool fathead minnows. They're laying their eggs right on the bottom side of a beaver chewed stick. So if you ask them, I mean, they're probably loving the beavers in this context. And just to plug that, if you're interested in learning more about native fish, you should get this book from the library. It's awesome. So all of these notions kind of add a lot of complexity to what we thought was a really simple question. And partly it's because we tend to manage species and not ecosystems. So real or even perceived impacts on species that are economically or socially important can take precedence in certain circumstances. And some of these questions I just put here as sort of like theoretical arguments, you know, that you could make from a fish kind of evangelist standpoint, like, you know, maybe it doesn't matter if trout can migrate upstream here this year, or this habitat's more important for sucker. I mean, this is like, haha, in a lot of contexts, but I mean, maybe these aren't so silly notions. And then to make it more complicated, when we're talking about beaver activity, we're usually thinking about building dams, felling trees, excavating channels, maybe building their food caches, but there's pond creation, dam failure, changes the stream temperature, habitat diversity, overwintering habitat. Beaver ponds are a great overwintering habitat. Sediment transport. I mean, there's like a million different things that are going on that beaver are having an influence on. And they're all interconnected. They influence one another. They're working at different scales and time series. And it's just like, oh my God, how are we going to answer this question? And then make it even more complicated, what is even a beaver dam, or what does beaver activity look like on the landscape? So it's just like a mess. There's a dam pool, there's flooding, there's some groundwater stuff going on that we can't even see. So yeah, really it's just like a lot of different processes and impacts going on. And you can really kind of see how this would happen when you look from above. So as we may know, beavers are ecosystem engineers. And so really what they're doing is they're taking these really simple habitats and they're transforming them into these complex, messy systems with all kinds of different flow paths and depths and water speeds. And so really they're like agents of change. So, okay, what is like some of the science telling us when it comes to the beaver and trout question? So there are lots and lots and lots of papers, like most of which I can't even touch on today, but There are some kind of key findings with regards to flow, temperature, fish passage, and habitat. And really, they kind of fall into some big themes. So the green boxes especially are ones that is like pretty clear, it seems, across a whole bunch of research, is that beaver dams attenuate flows. So that just means that flooding happens at a less severe extent, and the time it takes that floodwater to go through the system is extended, so it's moving slower through, and the same goes for droughts and low water. And beavers are really generating a lot of habitat heterogeneity, and that just means complexity. So they're making simple systems more messy. All the stuff about fish passage and temperature and flow, there's very context specific. So at each place and site and flow and time of year and size, there's going to be differences here. And some of those differences I think would do well to embrace uncertainty. And really what makes a stream healthy for the native trout. So I'm sure some of us have heard of the 4 C's, so cold, clean, complex, and connected. And you might think that's a weird picture to choose for connected. But really, I think it's the perfect picture, because historically, we have really thought about connectivity as just along a stream. So what can go from one place to another along a stream. And really what we're starting to do in river restoration and stream corridor ecology is think about how is a river connected to its floodplain. So how are all of these upland and riparian processes linked to all these aquatic processes? So how are the trees and shrubs and their life cycles impacting the water, and vice versa? And this image is a good one because we actually have some bull trout movement studies going on, and a bull trout swam right through this dam last September. So these are kind of some horandograms, so you don't need to look too closely here, but basically what I'm trying to show you is that streams are on sort of a circular evolutionary path. So they are always changing states in different speeds. But basically what I'm trying to illustrate here is that the stream on the left is really simple, and accordingly it has not a lot of habitat, and the habitat that it has is pretty simple. There's not a lot of it, and the attributes of that habitat are pretty simple. So it's like a simple low habitat kind of scenario. On the right, there's a lot of structure. It's really messy. There's a lot more habitat and a lot more habitat types. Looking at it from more of a, I guess, intuitive sense, this is a good graphic moving from like a dry, degraded, simple stream channel with a single thread to a more complex beaver influence system. And you can see that it just, I mean, it looks like a mess, but there's so many different little microhabitats and niches. And so, you know, streams were probably ebbing and flowing between states all in the spectrum before we took some of these engineers off the landscape. So getting into the concept of beaver restoration, it's a really exciting thing. I'm working in this field right now, and I'm pretty fired up about it. So I'm gonna have to check some of my biases here, but importantly, maybe this is a lesson for me as well, is that it's not a tool for everywhere all the time. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. This picture here, it looks messy. There's flooded trees. I don't even know where the channel is. Awesome, just like leave it alone. But there's a lot of places that are really broken and they could use some fixing. So this is a perfect example. It used to be a West Slope cutthroat trout stream. This might be a good place for beaver restoration. And really, when we're doing beaver restoration, we're talking about role playing as beavers. So a lot of the places where we're doing this work, there used to be a lot of beavers, which earlier I mentioned was a lot of places. The little blue blobs here are old beaver ponds. And this is a stream that now dries up and the fish are pretty much gone. So the beavers left, the stream got dry, got simple, it's degraded, and the fish are gone. This is what it looks like. It's the same picture from an earlier slide. So this was a good candidate to do beaver restoration at. So here we are building what's called a beaver dam analog. So basically a mock beaver dam. So we're putting in some vertical posts. They're untreated, they're just pine posts. And this is kind of the end result. So that's our best imitation of a beaver dam. And really the stamp of gold approval, I guess, here would be some beavers come back to this site and take it over, and we can defer decision-making to the system. So we can kind of take our hands off of this and let some of those processes continue on naturally. Here's some happy people with their completed beaver dam analog. And really, there's a lot of real estate out there to be doing this stuff at. I mean, this is a common site. It's all over the place. There's probably 100 little headwater creeks look like this in the forest reserve. Yeah, I mean, there's tons of examples of incised, dried up, simplified stream channels that used to have fish. So really, like, you know, the world is your oyster. There's all kinds of good spots to be doing some of this stuff. This is actually a tributary of Rocky Creek. Used to be a quad trail. Here's another one. Lots of real estate. And linking this right back to one of the first slides, does this not look like that cartoon image? It's like a spitting image. And this is 1947. So really today we're just still trying to connect some of these learnings and use some new tools. And I think beaver restoration would be a good tool to use. And on that note, there's some great resources out there. There's a whole manual for this kind of stuff. And it's really exciting because all this work is done by just people power. So yeah, and we're hosting a workshop in May. So you should check that out as well. And that's all. Thank you. There I am beside a beaver dam.
Awesome. Thank you, Elliot. You ask a lot of great dam questions. And we've now learned that cows and fish could maybe be friends, and that beaver and fish are certainly friends. But I'm going to let our last presenter speak to or answer why the fish would cross the road. And so I'll invite Petra Rowell to unmute, to turn on her camera and share her presentation while I introduce her. So Petra, after graduating from the University of Alberta in 1990, spent 2 decades working as a wildlife biologist across the province, contributing to migratory bird studies, endangered species recovery, and land stewardship programs. Since 2003, she's been working with a number of watershed partnerships in developing policies, plans, and projects to support achievement of Alberta's Water for Life goals. Having recently joined the Athabasca Watershed Council, her focus is now on helping this organization deliver its mandate in the Athabasca watershed, an area that makes up almost 1/4 of Alberta's land base, and that includes a significant portion of Alberta's northern eastern slopes. Pardon me. Take it away, Petra.
Thanks, Amy. Can you hear me all right? And can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Great. Well, thanks very much, everyone. I am totally in awe of all the great knowledge and expertise that's online tonight, and also slightly intimidated. So I'm hoping that rather than maybe putting questions in the chat, maybe you can instead share your advice with me. This is a new project for us, and working in the East Slopes is a bit new for us. So we're on a learning curve, and this is early days. All right, so just to get started, just really quickly, a few words about who is the Athabasca Watershed Council. We're a registered charity, and we were formed in 2009. We'll be celebrating 15 years next year. We have our office in the old train station in the town of Athabasca. We've got 3 staff and 3 interns, and we're governed by a 21-member board, which sort of represents all the sectors, government, industry, non-government, and Indigenous communities that are present in the Athabasca watershed. As Amy mentioned, the Athabasca is Alberta's 2nd longest river next to the Peace. And if you look at all the lands in this map that drain into the Athabasca, we make up almost 1/4 of the province's land base. But we have a really small population. So we're about 200,000, so less than 5% of Alberta's population, even though it is a very busy landscape. Like all of Alberta's 11 watershed councils, we're guided by the Water for Life strategy. So in every watershed, we're working towards 3 goals: safe, secure drinking water supply, healthy aquatic ecosystems, and reliable supplies for the economy. And to do this, we use an adaptive management approach where we start by assessing watershed health. We develop plans to address issues. We implement those plans, and we do monitoring to see if those plans are making any difference. And then we do this in an iterative and adaptive loop, trying to continuously improve our watersheds. We also do a lot of convening and collaborating and sharing education and information. So like all the other watershed councils, when the Athabasca formed in 2009, the first thing we did was a major study working on what is the state of the Athabasca watershed. And one of the key learnings from that is, again, it's a really big landscape. It's a quarter of the province. And so to be expected, there's different issues in different parts of the watershed. There's even different pressures, you know, and with being that it's the Athabasca, a lot of people focus on the lower part of the basin, looking at that oil sands area. But actually, if you look at the ABMI human footprint, the upper watershed or the upper Athabasca has about a 30% of the landscape has a human footprint, whereas in the lower Athabasca, it's only about 9%. So with this, the key takeaway was we really need to work on a smaller scale. There's no one activity that we can do that's best for the whole Athabasca. We really need to look at each sub-basin. So today we're focusing on the different sub-basins and looking at what the right tool is for the right issue. So for example, in the upper McLeod, we're doing some benthic invertebrate sampling. This area has a legacy of coal mining and other activities and issues with selenium affecting water quality. So benthic sampling seems to be the right tool. Further to the east, when we get down into the middle part of the Athabasca, where we have a much larger agricultural footprint, we're doing a lot more riparian assessment and restoration, working with agricultural producers, doing things like fencing cows out of the creek. Beaver management becomes a big issue again in that agricultural area. And moving further to the east, we start getting into some of our large lakes like Lac-La-Biche, and we're really excited to be working with the County of Lac-La-Biche on a lake management plan. So again, trying to think about what is the issue in the local area and who are the groups affected and what is the right tool to work with those groups. So all of that brings us to the Wildhay-Berland. This is a lovely small watershed. If you look on the map and think about where Hinton is, the Wildhay and the Berland are sort of to the northwest of the town of Hinton, below Grand Cache and below Fox Creek to the north. It's a very typical East Slopes watershed. I don't know if you can see it on this map of Alberta, but it's actually this #1 and #2 watershed. It's a very busy landscape. It's very important regionally to the local Indigenous communities. So we're in the area of Treaty 6 and Alexis Nakota Sioux First Nation. We're also in the Métis Nation Region 4. And there's a lot of local groups, the Winawak Nation and Mountain Métis that identify this area as important. There's lots of other land uses that you typically find in our green area. So forestry, oil and gas, transportation with Highway 40 and the rail line going right through the middle of these two watersheds. And there's even a little bit of ranching. So this picture below, you can see is just kind of a typical satellite screenshot of the area where the Wildhay comes into the Berland, and a little further stream, the Berland comes into the Athabasca. So as probably more of you know more about it than I do, this area was identified as a priority. These two subbasins are priorities both provincially and federally because they have Athabasca rainbow trout throughout these two little watersheds. And as you know, the rainbow trout was listed as endangered and a recovery strategy was released a couple of years ago now. And this area is also important for Western Arctic bull trout. And of course, all of you are familiar with these maps showing where bull trout used to be and where they are no longer. And But I want to make the point, though, that the Wildhay and the Berland are also important for other species. A really interesting comment that was made by some of the local communities was that in their lifetime, they don't think that they will ever again be able to harvest bull trout or rainbow trout. And so that makes them turn to other species, even like pike and walleye, because that's something that they can still harvest, and that's important to them. So that put a little bit of a different spin on what we think are priorities for some of these subbasins and the communities that live in them. So again, like any East Slopes watershed, what are the issues? I'm glad already tonight you've heard people talk about cumulative effects. It's probably a whole bunch of things. We know we have waters getting warmer with climate change, and that's probably impacting fish habitat. We know we've got lots of land use disturbance, lots of land use activity on the landscape that's causing erosion and sedimentation and some water quality issues. And even more so, we know that there's lots of issues with watercourse crossings, and that has been looked at in the Wildhay-Berland quite a lot, and it's been mapped. There's about 370 road and rail crossings. That doesn't include recreational crossings. So there's 370 crossings, and of those, about 16% are probably creating problems. So that's about 60 crossings in the Wildhay-Berland that need to be addressed because they're blocking upstream habitat. And so probably at least 7% of habitat of these two trout species is blocked because of road crossings, and usually it's a culvert issue. Oh, and I should just say ABMI has done an assessment of connectivity for these two watersheds. And for the Berland, they show about 68% connectivity, and a little bit less for the Wildhay, about 65% connectivity. So again, what can we do about it in this lovely little watershed to bring back connectivity and make sure there's lots of good habitat for those two trout species? The nice thing to know is that, you know, there's still lots of good habitat in these two watersheds. It's not gone so far that it's no point of return. There's actually, you know, it's not too bad. We're sort of in a medium situation. And so it's a really good time to get active and try to correct some of the past historical issues. And it's a watershed where we still can affect a good change that can lead to an improvement in these endangered species. But in the past, we've sort of done, you know, kind of that one-on-one. We found one particular location, and we've put a lot of money and resources to it, and we've, you know, fixed that one area. But again, knowing that there's 59 more to go, maybe there's another way to approach this issue. And this poster is just from a watercourse crossing project in the area of Hinton that was done a number of years ago. And the first executive director of the Athabasca Watershed Council, Connie Bresnahan, was really involved with the Hardesty Creek project that many of you are probably familiar with as well. But in thinking about all of the watercourse crossings, we were taking a little bit of a different approach. And we were really happy that the Canadian Wildlife Federation came to us with a new tool that they've developed. And they've trialed this tool, this connectivity planning tool, in 4 different watersheds in BC. And they're working with us to sort of share their learnings with us about how to do a connectivity plan at a sub-watershed basis, and how that can help us sort of maximize our resources and leverage our capacity. So we have a really wonderful user group for the Berland Wildhay that's working on this connectivity plan. Already, you know, there's a lot of watercourse crossing work already being done on the landscape, and we really recognize the great work being done by the government of Alberta and their watercourse crossing program, and also the Foothill Research Institute and their Foothill Stream Crossing Partnership, and the Alberta Watercourse Collaborative. So there's a lot of things on the ground, and it's really just a matter, you know, our role is trying to bring all of those folks together and look at specifically these 2 sub-watersheds and put together a little bit of a planning process and at the end of the day to develop this connectivity plan. The plan is just a voluntary guidance tool. It's not a regulatory exercise, but again, it's just a matter of convening, getting everybody together, and hopefully we can sort of take the scarce resources that we have in this very large landscape with a small population, and try and look at the points and try and maximize which sites get remediated first, and that will translate into the most habitat being opened up at one time. And of course, our plan won't only just focus on watercourse crossings, it will also look to see if there's other issues that we can address as a working group. Some of that might be education. We've got lots of recreation in that area and doing the recreation communication and messaging. And there's lots of room for doing lots of other research to look at some of the other issues in the area. So to date, our working group has met 6 times. They've set an ambitious goal. They'd like to see the proportion of linear habitat accessible to cold water salmonids in the Berland to be increased to 95% by 2032, so about 10 years. And that involves opening up access to about 300 kilometers of linear habitat. Obviously, that means some of the key actions means we've got to make sure that we're well engaged with industry and all of those watercourse crossing owners. And some of those owners are already participating in some of the programs that already exist, but there's also some crossings that are sort of orphans. They don't really belong to any industry group, and we have to think about ways to address those. And also, you know, there's some watercourse crossings that belong to individual organizations that aren't part of any other regulatory or volunteer programs. We also want to make sure that watercourse crossing owners know that there is help available to them. For example, the Alberta Environment, I believe, has put more funding into the municipal grant program this year. And so we really want to make sure that our municipalities are all aware of those dollars. And of course, again, we want to keep encouraging lots of other activities like water quality work to make sure that at the end of the day that the work that we're doing around watercourse crossings is also making a difference to water quality and fish habitat. This is just a list of everybody that we have that's been involved so far, but I think my big message to all of you is if you'd like to be involved in the Berland Wildhay, to give me a shout. We'd love to have you. We'd love to have more expertise and folks helping us out to make a difference. And finally, I'll just, I know we're running short, but just really quickly, I just want to say that it's really important that, you know, we're trying to get more awareness about the northern east slopes in the Athabasca and the Peace. But we really want to make sure that we're connecting with other East Slopes initiatives all across the whole East Slopes. And we're really interested in looking at sort of the policy and legislation around East Slopes protection and protecting our headwaters and our source waters. And also maybe looking at more protection. Right now, the Athabasca watershed, we have about 14% of the area is under protected, and we'd like to see that goal of 30% by 2030. And finally, Amy suggested this talk should be called "Why Did the Fish Cross the Road?" I'm really hoping that Alberta fish don't have to cross any roads, but this picture, which I think is from Oregon, reminds me that our wildlife are really resilient, and if we get some of our own mess out of the way, they will find a way to persevere. So with that, thanks everybody.
Thank you for answering that important question. And with that, could all the panelists please turn their cameras on, and we will move to our question and answer period. We are running a little short on time, so we'll try to fit in a few questions. And before we wrap up tonight, I do have a final poll to launch and of course some funders to thank. We'll start off with a question for Craig. So how has grazing on public land, how has that management changed in response to the federal listing of aquatic species at risk, such as the West Slope cutthroat trout, bull trout, and Athabasca rainbow trout?
Okay, how has it changed? I think the one would be more focused. I'm just thinking through that, like we have public lands range agrologists who promote, who work with leaseholders all through during their disposition management. And I can remember that when I started, was riparian management was a huge thing, right? And riparian management, you know, we felt keeping, as the Cows and Fish message, keeping the riparian in good shape, you help with water quality and habitat and all the things. And so we started a lot of, yeah, especially I can remember when I first started, a real push that all agrologists really understand riparian assessment and how it works. Another important part that I think is to be mentioned, you know, longer focus is that we've been a partner with Cows and Fish forever. It seems. Cows and Fish is it's a really valuable partnership for us. One with their assessment, their assessment understands the riparian, and with that, we can work on solutions for it. It's all usually a multiple use problem, and that's another value of Cows and Fish, is bring many people to the table. It doesn't have to just be the single producer or that to go through. One of the things that I always have really makes me proud to be a board member is this is a diligent bunch who works on a series of small projects, and those small projects, when you put them together, precipitate big change. And I think that's what we're all about here. So to how it's focused, I think, is just recently we've worked on kind of an Eastern Slopes program initiative that Amy's well aware of, and part of, and that basically is focusing on the Eastern Slopes for education, for knowledge, but also all those small projects that mitigate. Important component of this thing is clean water is also really important to a producer. I mean, no one will deny that you know, it's easier for livestock and all that to have cleaner water and cleaner water sources, and so it becomes a really important feature to it. So I think that you know, when you start working collaborative with producers, you end up with you know, solution base for each one of the issues that turn into that. And I think that's the important part, that working with the agrologists and Cows and Fish and the producers, you come up with these big solutions that way. I think I'll stop there, or I could prattle on for a long time if you want me to, but I have a feeling you want me to stop. So.
Thanks, Craig. A comment and a question. There was a comment made that the work that's being done on the restoration side has been very inspiring, but someone wanting to know what the main challenges of sort of doing these projects, whether that's the Rocky Creek project, or Elliot, the projects in Trout Creek, and then Petra, some of the ones that you're working on in the Berland. So I'll leave that to any of you to answer.
I mean, I guess from our perspective, I think the biggest challenge, and it's like a big one, it's hard to change, is that most of our like systems of management and control are reactive. And so we have a regulatory system that is like meant to assess impacts from development and things like that, and not necessarily it's like a harm prevention system, which makes sense, it's logical. But we don't really have like a corresponding system to facilitate restoration. So yeah, I think there's a lot more like low tech, simple, low risk work that could probably be happening at a broader scale, being done by more people in more places, if we had some different systems of management in that regard. That's always a challenge, just a people challenge.
Laura, Jess, Petra, care to add to the challenges of, you know, sort of scaling up these types of habitat recovery projects?
I think that is one of the issues. You know, for every one restoration site that gets done, there's a whole bunch more activity. And so how do we ensure that any, you know, I see in the questions, there's quite a few questions about pipelines and logging and stuff. And I don't want to answer regulatory questions tonight, but we have to make sure that any new activity is not creating some of the same, not adding to the same old historical legacy that we have left over. and we have to speed up how we address that legacy issue. And we don't have any answers, but we are doing a little bit, or I should say Canadian Wildlife Federation is trying to do sort of a jurisdictional review to see if anybody else in other jurisdictions has figured this out better than we have. You know, how do we make sure our policies and our regulations are in place so that we're not constantly creating these legacy historical issues? We're playing catch up.
Yeah, and I would add it's a people challenge as well. So when I think about trail remediation, behind the scenes, there's a lot of discussion that happens before we even get out there with a willow, because it's a multi-use landscape. And so we really try to still provide the opportunities and needs for everyone who uses that. So it could be a grazing leaseholder who needs access so that they can manage their herd appropriately. There are recreational users that would still like to be able to get out, and that's motorized and non-motorized. There's fishermen who also need to have access to fisheries. And then again, the list of people go on. And so being able to collect all of these opinions and then work with people to achieve consensus can take quite a bit of time. And sometimes that can be a little bit challenging because, again, in some cases, native trout don't have a lot of time. And so that's one of the key challenges that I often face in my job.
Thank you. And I believe this question is for you and Laura as well, Jessica. Is the Joe Model Cumulative Effects by Watershed app available to view and explore online?
I was just typing out an answer, but
Okay.
yeah, it is. We have sort of Joe model populated for Athabasca rainbows, West Slope cuts, and bull trout. It's not as user-friendly as we want it to be, so you need a specific format for an Excel spreadsheet to play around with inputs and stressors and stuff like that. I'll actually plunk my email in the chat, and if you want to, I think it was from Josh. Yeah, if you want to email me, I can show you the app. Also, small plug, UBC, DFO, many grad students are actually working on a way more user-friendly web-based Shiny app that would allow people almost like a blank forum to put any species and just play, and it's way more user-friendly than the one we've created. So hopefully stay tuned, and that should be happening relatively soon too.
Awesome. Well, we are at 8:30, so before we wrap up, I'll just ask, there's still a few remaining questions in the chat box. So if it's directed towards you, if the presenters, while I launch the final poll, if you can type out an answer or maybe contact info for them to email you, if that's appropriate, then please go ahead and do that. And thank you so much for everybody that put a question in the box. Again, you will get an extra entry for every question into the draw for our generous prize donations from Banded Peak and from the Outdoor Show and from the Bow Habitat Station, as well as the Native Trout Collaborative. So yes, please answer what you feel the impact of today's session was. Did you learn anything new? I hope you did. And will this workshop impact the way you interact with native trout and their habitats in the future? And I'll just put up a final slide for our funders, which is the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the Alberta Conservation Association, and Alberta Government, with Alberta Environment Parks, and now Alberta Forestry Parks, Alberta Environment and Protected Areas, and Alberta Forestry Parks and Tourism. And so with that, Logan, I'll get you to end the poll and share the results. I'm happy to see that 97% of people learned something new. There's some pretty smart people on this. Like I recognize like a few names, like career, kind of legends in here. So, if they didn't learn anything new, my feelings aren't too hurt, but I'm glad that 97% of you did. And with that, I will say thank you so much for attending. Again, in these last couple seconds, if I'll let presenters answer any questions, and then I will say good night. Hearing nothing, I will end the session. Have a good night.